Al Kubra asterisk, it immediately carries weight. It sounds heavy, dramatic, almost cinematic, and for many people it triggers images of chaos, war, and the end of the world as we know it. But before emotions take over, before imagination runs too far ahead, we need to slow down and do what our tradition has always taught us to do. Understand our terms before we build conclusions on them. Because Islam has never been a faith of slogans without substance, nor of fear without knowledge, the word asterisk Malhama asterisk in classical Arabic comes from a root that conveys the idea of intense conflict, severe trial, or a moment where matters reach a breaking point. It does not inherently mean mindless violence. Rather, it points to a situation where human beings are pushed to their limits. And asterisk Al Kubra asterisk simply means the greatest, or the most significant. So linguistically, we are talking about a asterisk great trial asterisk, a asterisk major upheaval asterisk, a moment in human history where tensions, struggles, and consequences reach a climax. Already, that definition should temper how we approach this topic. It is not a call to arms, and it is not a countdown clock. It is a description, not a command. Now, when we turn to Islamic sources, we find references to intense periods of turmoil near the end of times. These references exist across Hadith literature, but here is where intellectual honesty becomes critical. Not every narration attributed to this topic is authentic, not every description is agreed upon, and not every detail is meant to be taken in a wooden, literal sense. Our scholars, past and present, have always warned against picking dramatic narrations while ignoring the rigorous science behind them. This is not skepticism. This is scholarly integrity. Some narrations speak about large-scale conflict, yes, but many scholars understood these reports as painting a broad picture of global instability rather than a precise script. The Prophet did not give us a screenplay for the future. He gave us signposts. And signposts are meant to guide behavior, not satisfy curiosity. When people obsess over timelines, locations, or who is who, they often miss the actual lesson staring them in the face. And that lesson is this: Malhama Al Kubra is not merely about swords and armies. It is about humanity under pressure. It is about what happens when moral systems collapse, when truth becomes negotiable, when power is worshipped, and when fear becomes a currency. Historically, Muslim scholars were far more concerned with the asterisk spiritual meaning asterisk of these narrations than with drawing battle maps. They asked, what kind of people emerge in times like this? What qualities are rewarded, and what qualities lead to destruction? There is also an important distinction that must be made between asterisk eschatology asterisk and asterisk sensationalism asterisk. Eschatology in Islam was never meant to paralyze the believer with dread or intoxicate them with fantasies of destruction. It was meant to wake them up, to remind them that history is not random, that injustice has consequences, and that moral decay eventually reaches a point of reckoning. When Malhama Al Kubra is discussed properly, it humbles us. When it is discussed irresponsibly, it inflates egos and fuels fear. We also need to recognize how every generation is tempted to believe they are living in the final chapter. This is not new. Muslims 1,000 years ago, during the Mongol invasions, genuinely believed the end was imminent. Others believed the same during the Crusades, the fall of Baghdad, the colonization of Muslim lands, and even during world wars. Each era saw suffering that felt unprecedented, and in many ways it was. But the lesson is not that they were foolish. The lesson is that human pain has always felt ultimate to those living through it. This should teach us humility in interpretation. Malhama Al Kubra may refer to a specific future reality known only to Allah, or it may describe a recurring pattern in human civilization that intensifies toward the end of time. Many scholars held that view, that the world does not collapse overnight, but through layers of moral erosion, injustice, and spiritual neglect. In that sense, Malhama Al Kubra is not just something we wait for, It is something we learn from. And here is where the conversation becomes deeply personal. The Prophet did not emphasize end times narrations so that believers would sit around speculating. He emphasized them so that believers would prepare themselves ethically. Notice how rarely these narrations are followed by instructions to fight, and how often they are followed by instructions to hold on to truth, to avoid, to protect life, and to guard one's tongue and heart. That tells us something profound about what Allah values when the world is unraveling. So when we speak of Malhama Al Kubra, we are not indulging in fear-mongering. We are acknowledging that history has direction, that trials intensify, and that human beings are tested most when certainty disappears. The real danger is not the trial itself. The real danger is losing our moral compass while trying to survive it. That is why the earliest scholars always tied these discussions back to character, worship, and responsibility. If this concept makes us anxious, then we have misunderstood it. And if it makes us arrogant, then we have abused it. The correct response is sobriety, humility, and resolve. Resolve to be people of principle no matter how loud the chaos becomes, because the greatest battle is not always the one happening on the ground. It is the one happening in the hearts of those who live through it. And that is why understanding Malhama Al Kubra correctly is not about predicting the end of the world. It is about deciding who we will be when the world is tested. One of the greatest mistakes we make when discussing end times material is flattening it into a single dimension. We assume that either it is all literal history waiting to happen, or it is all metaphor with no real world relevance. Our tradition is far more nuanced than that. When scholars spoke about Malhama Al Kubra, they did not isolate it from history, nor did they dissolve it into abstraction. They understood that revelation speaks to human beings who live in time, experience cycles, and learn through patterns. And this is where historical context and eschatological meaning must be held together, not pitted against one another. When we look back at Islamic history, we find moments that genuinely felt like the world was ending. Cities burned, scholars were killed, institutions collapsed, and entire civilizations were shaken. During the Mongol invasions, rivers reportedly ran black with ink and red with blood. Baghdad, the heart of the Muslim world, fell in a way that traumatized generations. People at that time were not irrational for thinking, this must be it. Their pain was real. Their fear was real, and yet history continued. Why does this matter? Because it teaches us that apocalyptic language often emerges in moments of civilizational crisis, not because people are weak, but because suffering has a way of compressing time and magnifying meaning. Our scholars were aware of this psychological reality. That is why many of them warned against reading every crisis as the crisis. They recognized that end times narrations often describe patterns rather than timestamps. Patterns of injustice rising, patterns of truth becoming blurred, patterns of power concentrating in the hands of the few while the many suffer. These patterns repeat themselves, intensify, and evolve. And toward the end of time, they reach a level of global saturation never seen before. That is the difference, not the existence of evil, but its scale, speed, and normalization. This is why Malhama Al Kubra cannot be reduced to a single battle on a single map. To do so is to miss the point. The narrations are not there to satisfy our curiosity about geography. They are there to awaken our conscience about trajectory. History is not random. Civilizations rise when justice, knowledge, and moral restraint are valued. They fall when arrogance, oppression, and deception become systemic. Malhama Al Kubra, in this sense, is not an interruption of history. It is the culmination of historical trends left unchecked. There is also a danger in romanticizing these events. Some people speak about the end times as though they are exciting, dramatic, even desirable. That mindset is deeply un-Islamic. The Prophet sought refuge from times of chaos, not invitations to them. Scholars spoke about these trials with trembling voices, not triumphant tones. Why? Because they understood that widespread upheaval is not a victory lap for the righteous. It is a devastating that spares no one emotionally, socially, or spiritually. When we strip Malhama Al Kubra of its symbolic depth, we risk turning it into a political tool. Throughout history, groups have claimed this is that moment to justify brutality, silence dissent, or grant themselves divine certainty. Our scholars consistently rejected this approach. They emphasized that eschatology is meant to limit arrogance, not empower it. The moment someone claims full clarity about how and when the end unfolds, they have already stepped outside the humility that this knowledge is meant to cultivate. Symbolism in the Islamic intellectual tradition does not mean fiction. It means layered meaning. A narration can refer to a real event while simultaneously pointing to a deeper moral reality. When the texts describe massive conflict, they are not only describing weapons clashing, they are describing values colliding, truth versus falsehood, justice versus power, mercy versus cruelty. And those battles are already happening, often quietly, often internally, long before they ever manifest externally. This perspective also protects us from despair. If Malhama Al Kubra were only a catastrophic endpoint, then what would be the role of the believer except fear and survival? But when we understand it as a stage in a larger divine plan, one that tests humanity while still holding them accountable, then our role becomes clear. We are not spectators waiting for collapse. We are moral agents tasked with resisting decay wherever we stand. History teaches us that societies do not collapse because of one event. They collapse because small compromises become habits, and habits become culture. Lies repeated often enough become different perspectives. Injustice tolerated long enough becomes normal. Malhama Al Kubra, in that sense, is the moment when the bill comes due, when accumulated, ignored cries and abandoned principles erupt into consequences that can no longer be managed or contained. And this is why scholars always tied these discussions back to personal responsibility. You cannot control global events, but you can control whether you contribute to moral erosion or moral resistance. You cannot stop history from unfolding, but you can decide whether you will be a source of clarity or confusion within it. The believer is not promised safety from turmoil. The believer is promised meaning within it. So when we situate Malhama Al Kubra between history and the unseen future, we stop asking the wrong questions. We stop asking, is this it? And start asking, what does Allah expect from me in times like this? That shift alone transforms fear into purpose. It reminds us that the end of times is not about predicting the final chapter, but about living the current one with integrity. Because in the end, the most dangerous misunderstanding is thinking that Malhama Al Kubra is about the end of the world, when in reality, it is about the exposure of the world as it truly is. When the texts speak about great trials near the end of time, one of the most consistent themes you will find is not the collapse of buildings, but the collapse of values. Long before societies fall physically, they fall morally. And this is something our tradition emphasizes again and again, because moral breakdown is quieter, more subtle, and far more dangerous than open chaos. You don't always hear it coming. Sometimes it arrives wearing the language of progress, convenience, or even virtue. The Prophet spoke about times when truth would become confusing, not absent. That distinction matters. Falsehood rarely announces itself honestly. It borrows the vocabulary of truth. Justice is rebranded. Oppression is justified. Exploitation is normalized, and people don't wake up one day and decide to abandon morality. They slowly redefine it until it no longer restrains them. This is how societies drift. This is how the ground softens before it collapses. One of the signs scholars repeatedly highlighted is the loss of trust. Trust in institutions, trust in leadership, trust between people. When trust disappears, fear takes its place. And fear is a powerful motivator. It makes people reactive instead of reflective. It pushes them to choose sides instead of principles. It convinces them that survival matters more than integrity. Once fear becomes the dominant emotion of a society, ethical lines blur very quickly. Another recurring theme is the erosion of truth itself. Not ignorance, but confusion. A time when people will struggle to distinguish sincerity from performance, knowledge from noise. Everyone has a platform, but not everyone has wisdom. Volume replaces credibility. Outrage replaces understanding. And in that environment, lies don't even need to be convincing. They just need to be loud and repeated. Scholars describe this as a form of fitna more dangerous than open disbelief because it exhausts the heart. People stop caring what is true and settle for what feels comfortable. Alongside this comes the normalization of injustice. Not dramatic tyranny at first, but selective outrage is condemned when it affects us, and excused when it benefits us. Principles become conditional. Compassion becomes tribal, and once morality becomes selective, it ceases to be morality at all. This is why the tradition emphasizes justice so relentlessly. Justice is not situational. The moment it is negotiated, it begins to disappear. One of the most sobering signs mentioned in the texts is the inversion of moral authority, when those who speak truth are dismissed as troublemakers, and those who spread harm are celebrated as leaders. When sincerity is mocked as naivete, and manipulation is praised as intelligence. This inversion doesn't happen overnight. It happens when societies reward results without questioning methods, when success becomes the highest virtue regardless of the cost. And perhaps the most painful sign of all is spiritual numbness. People still perform rituals, still use religious language, but the heart is no longer engaged. Worship becomes habit, not transformation. Ethics become aesthetics. Religion becomes an identity marker rather than a moral compass. Scholars feared this state deeply because it creates the illusion of righteousness without its substance. And an illusion, once believed, is harder to correct than open wrongdoing. What makes these signs so unsettling is that none of them feel dramatic while they are happening. They feel normal, they feel gradual, people adapt, they lower expectations, they say, "This is just how the world is now." And that sentence, spoken often enough, is the sound of moral surrender. The end of times, according to our tradition, is not marked by humanity's sudden rebellion against God, but by humanity's quiet forgetfulness of Him. This is why the prophet consistently redirected attention inward. He did not tell people to obsess over identifying every sign. He told them to guard their hearts, because when moral breakdown becomes widespread, the greatest danger is not being surrounded by corruption. It is becoming desensitized to it. When wrong no longer shocks us, when injustice no longer disturbs us, when lying no longer bothers us, something inside us has shifted. And this is where responsibility returns to the individual. You cannot control the trajectory of the world, but you can refuse to internalize its decay. You can insist on honesty when lying is profitable. You can choose restraint when outrage is rewarded. You can protect your heart when cynicism feels easier. These choices may feel small, but they are acts of resistance in times of fitna. The signs of moral breakdown are not given to make us hopeless. They are given to make us vigilant. They remind us that faith is not proven when it is popular, but when it is costly, that character is not revealed in comfort, but under pressure, and that the greatest loss in times of trial is not safety or stability, but the loss of moral clarity. Because when the world grows dark, the most powerful response is not to curse the darkness, but to refuse to let it extinguish the light within you. When times of fitna intensify, our instinct is often to look outward, to ask who is right, who is wrong, who caused this, and who will fix it. But one of the most striking features of the prophetic guidance regarding periods of turmoil is how consistently it redirects responsibility back to the individual, not as an escape from reality and not as passivity, but as moral grounding. Because when the external world becomes unstable, the only thing you can truly anchor is your own conduct. The Prophet did not teach his companions to chase chaos or insert themselves recklessly into every conflict. In fact, he warned repeatedly about impulsiveness during times of confusion. He emphasized restraint, patience, and wisdom, not because injustice should be ignored, but because unprincipled reactions often multiply harm rather than reduce it. There is a difference between courage and recklessness, and fitna has a way of blurring that line if we are not careful. One of the most difficult responsibilities during times of trial is guarding the tongue. In moments of tension, words become weapons, rumors spread faster than facts, accusations travel farther than truth, and people feel justified saying anything as long as it serves their side. The prophetic model, however, treats speech as a moral act. Silence, when driven by wisdom, can be an act of worship. Speaking, when driven by ego or anger, can be a form of destruction. Not every truth needs to be shouted, and not every silence is cowardice. Discernment is the key. Another responsibility is resisting the pull of polarization. Fitna thrives on forcing false binaries. You are either with us or against us, either fully aligned or fully condemned. This mentality suffocates nuance and crushes justice. The believer is not loyal to camps. The believer is loyal to principles, and principles often require standing uncomfortably in the middle, refusing to sanctify even when it comes from one's own side. That is not weakness, that is moral strength. Patience in this context does not mean passivity. It means refusing to let anger hijack judgment. It means understanding that not every injustice can be corrected immediately, and that hasty action without wisdom often leads to regret. The Quran praises patience not because it is easy, but because it restrains the ego at precisely the moment the ego wants control. In times of upheaval, patience becomes a shield against becoming the very thing we claim to oppose. Unity is another principle that is often misunderstood. Unity does not mean uniformity, and it certainly does not mean silence in the face of wrongdoing. It means refusing to let disagreements dehumanize others. Fitna fractures communities by turning difference into hostility. The responsibility of the believer is to preserve dignity even in disagreement, to remember that shared faith places limits on how far conflict is allowed to go. Once those limits disappear, the damage lasts far longer than the dispute itself. Justice, above all, remains non-negotiable. One of the most dangerous temptations in times of chaos is selective morality. We justify actions we would condemn if done by others. We excuse harm when it benefits us. But the tradition is uncompromising here. Justice is not suspended during crisis. It is most needed then. The believer is not defined by who they oppose, but by how consistently they uphold what is right. There is also the responsibility of self-awareness. Fitna exposes what lies beneath the surface. It reveals whether faith is rooted in conviction or convenience. Some people discover courage they did not know they had. Others discover fragility masked by comfort. This is not a cause for despair, it is an opportunity for honesty. Trials strip away illusions. They force us to confront who we are when pressure removes our filters. And perhaps the most overlooked responsibility is restraint from self-righteousness. Times of turmoil inflate egos. Everyone believes they see clearly while others are blind, but humility is protection. The Prophet taught that guidance is a gift from Allah, not a trophy of intelligence. The moment we assume moral superiority, we stop listening, and the moment we stop listening, we become dangerous, no matter how noble our intentions may feel. The tradition does not present fitna as something to be solved once and for all, but as something to be navigated faithfully. You may not be able to stop the storm, but you are accountable for how you sail through it. Do you abandon your ethics when they become inconvenient? Do you sacrifice truth for belonging? Do you trade long-term integrity for short-term victory? These are not abstract questions. They are daily choices. They show up in conversations, online behavior, business dealings, family disputes, and political opinions. And every choice either strengthens the moral fabric or weakens it. This is why the Prophet focused so much on character. It is the one thing fitna cannot take from you unless you hand it over willingly. Because in times when the world feels like it is losing its balance, the believer's responsibility is simple, but never easy, to remain upright when everything else is leaning. When people hear about great trials, their minds often jump to external preparation resources, strategies, survival. But one of the most counterintuitive teachings of our tradition is that the most important preparation for times of upheaval is internal. Not because the external world doesn't matter, but because when pressure increases, whatever is inside you is what comes out. Trials do not create character, they reveal it. And that is why faith, awareness, and self-reform are emphasized so relentlessly in these discussions. Faith, in this context, is not emotional intensity or dramatic expression. It is steadiness. It is the ability to remain anchored when certainty feels scarce. Scholars understood Iman as something that fluctuates, something that requires maintenance, especially when distractions multiply and confusion becomes constant. In times of fitna, faith is not tested by how loudly you speak about it, but by how consistently it shapes your decisions when no one is watching. This is also why knowledge becomes so critical. Not surface-level information, not endless consumption of opinions, but grounded understanding. Awareness protects faith from being hijacked. Many people lose their moral compass not because they stop believing, but because they stop thinking critically. They follow whoever speaks with confidence, whoever confirms their fears, whoever validates their anger. The tradition warns us about this repeatedly. Ignorance during times of trial is not neutral. It is dangerous. True awareness teaches restraint. It teaches you to pause before reacting, to verify before spreading, to reflect before judging. It reminds you that not everything urgent is important, and not everything loud is true. This kind of awareness does not come from constant exposure to chaos. It comes from intentional distance, from silence, from grounding oneself in timeless principles rather than trending narratives. Self-reform, then, becomes the bridge between faith and action. It is easy to talk about the failures of society. It is far harder to confront the compromises we make daily. Fitna has a way of externalizing blame. Everyone else is the problem. Leadership is corrupt. Systems are broken, and all of that may be true. But the Quran repeatedly redirects us inward, not to excuse injustice, but to remind us that collective decay is built from individual neglect. The great scholars of the past were deeply wary of activism without purification, not because they opposed reform, but because they understood human psychology. When anger leads and the ego is unchecked, even righteous causes can become vehicles for oppression. Self-reform is not a retreat from the world. It is preparation to engage it without becoming corrupted by it. This reform begins with sincerity. Why do I believe what I believe? Why do I support what I support? Is it truth or is it identity? Is it justice or is it ego? These questions are uncomfortable, but they are necessary. Fitna exposes motives, and if motives are not purified, actions lose their blessing even when they appear successful. Another critical element of preparation is emotional discipline. Trials overwhelm people not just intellectually, but emotionally. Anxiety, anger, despair, and cynicism become constant companions. Without spiritual grounding, these emotions dictate behavior. Faith teaches regulation. It teaches that not every emotion deserves obedience, that feelings are signals, not authorities, that calmness is not denial, but control. Prayer plays a central role here, not as ritual, but as recalibration. It slows the heart down, it recenters priorities, it reminds the believer that history is not spiraling out of control, it is unfolding under divine knowledge. This does not erase pain, but it places it within meaning. And meaning is what allows people to endure without becoming bitter. Self-reform also requires humility. Times of confusion inflate confidence. Everyone thinks they see clearly while others are blind. But humility protects faith from arrogance. It keeps the heart soft. It keeps the believer teachable. The moment someone believes they are immune to misguidance is the moment they become most vulnerable to it. And perhaps the most important aspect of preparation is consistency. Not bursts of religious intensity followed by burnout, but steady, quiet commitment. Small acts done regularly outlast dramatic gestures done briefly. In times of fitna, consistency becomes revolutionary. Choosing honesty repeatedly, choosing mercy repeatedly, choosing restraint repeatedly. These are not glamorous acts, but they are transformative. The tradition does not promise that preparation will make trials disappear. It promises that preparation will make you recognizable to Allah within them, and that is the ultimate success. Not safety, not comfort, not control, but integrity. Because when the world shakes, it is not those who know the most theories who endure, but those whose hearts have been trained to stand. When we step back and look at the world we are living in right now, it becomes impossible to treat discussions of Malhama Al Kubra as distant or abstract. Not because we can claim certainty about timelines or events, but because the asterisk conditions described in our tradition feel uncomfortably familiar. Polarization is no longer occasional, it is structural. Misinformation is no longer accidental, it is strategic. Injustice is no longer shocking, it is debated, justified, and often monetized. And perhaps most telling of all, people are exhausted, not just physically, but morally. One of the clearest lessons these end-times discussions offer is that chaos does not always arrive as collapse. Sometimes it arrives as confusion. When people can no longer agree on basic truths, when every fact has a counter-fact, and every principle has an exception, society does not need to fall apart dramatically. It simply loses its ability to correct itself. That is one of the most dangerous states a civilization can reach, because when accountability disappears, decline accelerates quietly. Our tradition teaches us that confusion is not morally neutral. Living in an age of constant information without wisdom is itself a test. People today are not lacking data, they are lacking discernment. Everyone has access to opinions, but few have the patience to verify, contextualize, or reflect. Outrage has become a shortcut to meaning, and outrage, when sustained, corrodes compassion. It trains people to see enemies instead of humans, victories instead of consequences. Another lesson is how easily injustice becomes normalized when it is wrapped in language that feels sophisticated. Rarely presents itself as cruelty. It presents itself as necessity, as security, as realism. And when societies repeatedly choose convenience over conscience, they slowly forget what justice even feels like. This is why the Quran does not only condemn oppression, it condemns becoming comfortable with it. Silence, when driven by apathy, is not neutrality, it is participation. Malhama Al Kubra, when understood properly, forces us to confront this reality, that the greatest danger is not that evil exists, but that it becomes rational, that people stop asking whether something is right and only ask whether it works. Once morality becomes subordinate to outcomes, anything can be justified, and everything eventually is. But here is where the lesson turns hopeful, because Islam never presents history as a tragedy without purpose. The point of recognizing these patterns is not despair, it is responsibility. You are not accountable for fixing the world, but you are accountable for how you move through it, and that distinction is liberating. It removes the burden of control while preserving the obligation of conscience. In times of widespread confusion, clarity becomes an act of worship. Refusing to lie when lying is rewarded. Refusing to dehumanize when dehumanization is normalized. refusing to surrender your ethics for the comfort of belonging. These are not passive choices. They are deeply active forms of resistance, and they matter more than we often realize. The tradition reminds us that Allah does not ask about outcomes we could not control. He asks about intentions and efforts we could. Were you just when it was inconvenient? Were you honest when dishonesty would have benefited you? Were you merciful when cruelty was applauded? These questions define success in times of trial far more than any political or social victory. Another powerful lesson is the importance of hope without delusion. Islam never asks believers to be naive, but it also never allows them to be cynical. Cynicism is a form of despair disguised as intelligence. It convinces people that integrity is pointless, that everyone is corrupt, that nothing truly matters. But cynicism paralyzes action. Hope, on the other hand, energizes responsibility, even when outcomes are uncertain. This hope is not rooted in believing that the world will suddenly become just. It is rooted in believing that justice is never wasted, even when it seems defeated. That no act of goodness disappears even when it feels small. That Allah's scale of success does not match ours. And that belief changes how a person lives, speaks, and chooses. Perhaps the most important lesson Malhama Al Kubra offers our generation is this: history is watching character, not commentary. Future generations will not only ask what happened, but how people responded. Did they preserve their humanity when it was under pressure? Did they protect truth when it became inconvenient? Did they refuse to become mirrors of the very corruption they opposed? And this brings us back to where all of this began. These discussions were never meant to make us obsessed with the end of the world. They were meant to make us serious about how we live before it ends, to remind us that faith is not proven in calm waters, but in storms. That principles are not tested when they are popular, but when they are costly. Because in the end, the true lesson of Malhama Al Kubra is not about when history collapses. It is about whether